share with you as a great title that you might find to be helpful. The title is Rest, Why You Get More Done When You Work Less. There's a great little description here on the back. I'll share just a few sentences. Overworking is the new normal. Rest is something to do when the important things are done, but they are never done. Looking at different forms of rest, from sleep to vacation, Silicon Valley futurist and business consultant Alex Soo-Young Kim Pang, the author, dispels the myth that the harder we work, the better the outcome. Whether by making space for daily naps, may or may not be possible in your context, as Winston Churchill did during World War II, going on strolls like Charles Darwin, or spending a week alone in a cabin like Bill Gates. Pursuing what Pine calls deliberate rest is the true key to fulfillment and creative success. Drawing on rigorous scientific evidence and revelatory historical examples, rest overturns everything our culture has taught us about work and shows that only by resting better can we start living better. So this is a great book. I highly recommend it. And he also has another book, which is really good, called The Distraction Addiction. So a futurist out of Silicon Valley telling us to rest more. Hope that is helpful. Okay. The power of feedback and how to have difficult conversations. I'm going to share. This is a cartoon. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of a performance appraisal that wasn't very well managed, this cartoon might resonate with you. So this is a fun, I'll read it out just in case there might be folks who find this difficult to read. In this review, I'll pretend I can accurately characterize you with a 2-digit rating, and you will pretend that this is a meaningful process of self-reflection. Too often, within the whole world of performance development, performance management, this is the experience. And at the core of a really effective performance conversation is a feedback conversation. And I love this book by Sheila Heen. I particularly love the subtitle. So the title is Thanks for the Feedback, and the subtitle is Even When It Is Off Base, Unfair, Poorly Delivered, and Frankly, You're Not in the Mood. That's one of the best subtitles I've seen for a book on feedback. And Sheila mentions here that feedback sits at the crux of 2 human needs. We all want to learn and grow, and we want to be accepted and respected for who we are now. So giving feedback is challenging, receiving feedback is challenging. Let's take a moment now as a group to reflect. And please go ahead and type into the group chat, what was your worst experience in receiving feedback? What was your worst experience in receiving feedback? So let's take a moment now and go ahead and type your comments into the chat. What was your worst experience to date in receiving feedback? We'll take a few minutes now for you to reflect and type your thoughts into the group chat. What was your worst experience in receiving feedback? Not receiving it at all. Why did not receive feedback? Absolutely, just a gaping void of silence. Not helpful. Not distinguishing facts from opinions. Yes. Asking for it and not getting any. When a manager just didn't like me on a personal level. BC is mentioning that while you're a superstar, the bonuses, the raise budget is not there for another year. Oh, all right. My manager started the conversation by saying, I don't agree with this, but try if you can. This is a great lesson from RA. Please try to remove the word but in a sentence. What it typically does is it negates everything that went before. So a typical phrase might be, you're doing a great job, but. So all that happens when I hear the word but is I completely discount what you said before it, and I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. So ideally, let's remove the word but. MD has said only positive and not constructive, so you're not nothing to improve on there. It doesn't help. Not specific, no examples. Generalizations. There was no consideration for the short-term personal situation. Boilerplate. Ignoring or forgetting things we previously agreed. Yes, usually these conversations are not in isolation. That was an interesting one, AP, not being... boss telling me I haven't accomplished my personal goals, and it made no sense since we were in a professional environment. Okay, so that is the dark side of feedback, dark side of what we can be on the receiving end of. Let's look at the brighter side, and would love for you to reflect on your best experience receiving feedback so far in your career. And if you go ahead and type into the chat what that best experience was. So what was your best experience in receiving feedback? Let's take a few moments now to capture the best side of the coin in the group chat here. Detailed things I could go away and know how to research. Yes, you could do something. You could do something with the feedback that was actionable. Constructive. Peer on peer. Yes, so it's not just a manager direct report tool here. Effective feedback can be experienced peer on peer as well. And MD sharing a nice trick here to receive constructive feedback. If I had to improve one thing, what would that be? Yes, that's a great question for everybody's tool belt there. Love that. Any other thoughts here on your best experience so far in receiving feedback? Back to specific. Excellent. Thank you, RM. So it wasn't a telling conversation. It sounds like it was more coaching, more exploratory. Yes. How might we do this together? So I'm not... So sharing the feedback and then switching gears, it sounds quite seamlessly into a coaching conversation. Beautiful. Okay, so some nice guidelines there on what makes for an ineffective and an effective feedback conversation. I'll share a few of these here, and you will hear some echoes of what you've already posted in the chat here. So ideally, and again, thinking in your role as a manager, it's important to share feedback frequently and in context. I had an experience once where I had a performance review in December, and I heard about something that I didn't do, that I got some negative feedback about something I did back in March. And that was the first time that I was hearing about it. So I was more than a little bit irritated to learn that there was something that I did back in March that I could have done something about back in March if I had received that feedback in March as opposed to December, when it felt like I couldn't do anything. I felt powerless. Several months later, obviously, to do anything about it. So that's another sidebar comment here, which is when it comes to performance appraisals and performance reviews, ideally, a performance review should be nothing more than a summary of previous conversations. Ideally, there should not be any new information in a performance appraisal. Ideally, it's a summary of previous conversations that have taken place. Ideally, the feedback aims to achieve a specific outcome. Specificity was something that was mentioned both in the worst experience that you've had in receiving feedback and also the best. So it wasn't specific, and it was specific. It makes a huge difference. It is realistic in its expectations. Shows respect. In the worst experience of feedback, there was a sense of being disrespected in those conversations, and the opposite in the best experience. receiving feedback. It is a two-way conversation. Much was as mentioned in RM's comment here. It wasn't a one-way monologue, but very much a two-way conversation. This one's critical, and it makes such a huge difference. It's expressed as a point of view rather than an absolute truth. In any feedback conversation, we have one version of the facts, and there could be at least two, if not three or four plus versions of what happened. We have a slice of what happened. There's probably additional context, additional information. So ideally, you're expressing it as a point of view rather than an absolute truth. Ideally, it assumes an opportunity for follow-up as well. That was something that was mentioned in your comments, that there was something that was actionable, that there was a chance to check back in. Ideally, there is an opportunity for follow-up. So let's take what makes feedback effective and let's work with a couple of examples here, and I'll ask you to reflect and note your comments in the group chat. So given what we know what makes for an effective feedback conversation, how might you phrase this feedback? So our first example. In the past month, Xavier has arrived consistently unprepared and late to the team meeting. How might you phrase that feedback? Please go ahead and type your thoughts into the group chat. So in the past month, Xavier has arrived consistently unprepared and late to the team meeting. How might you phrase that feedback? Let's take a few minutes to reflect and note your comments in the group chat. Prepared and on time to the team meeting, and then the behavior shifted. So great to get curious about what that change might be. Excellent. AT is again back to understanding the reason. Wonderful. And then explaining how it affects the team. Lately, you're not prepared and come late to the meetings. Thank you, MD. Everything okay? Expectation change behavior. So these are nicely specific. Digging in to find some more answers. Excellent. Okay. Next, TI just popped in here. Last month, we observed that you were not enough prepared and late to the meetings. Again, we're getting to a little bit of the impact of that behavior, which is excellent. Next example, you received a complaint from a customer about how Taylor responded to her request for assistance. The customer said Taylor was, quotes, curt and unresponsive. You received a complaint from a customer about how Taylor responded to her request for assistance. The customer said Taylor was curt and unresponsive. How would you phrase that feedback to Taylor? Next one, so starting with an open-ended question. Or I'm saying this would not be a surprise. May or may not be, depending. MF is saying, hey, Taylor spoke. The customer who felt your energy was not as expected. Is that a one-off event? Anything I can help you with or improve? LN. A nice summary statement there, and I'd like to hear from your side what happened. EB, something similar, finding out Taylor's point of view, raising it to her, not stating as a fact. Beautiful. Okay. And our final example here is upward feedback. So you heard from a colleague that the timeline of your product launch was pushed up by your manager. The beta version is scheduled for release 2 weeks ahead of the date you had already discussed. Your manager did not tell you. This is the third time this kind of thing has happened, and your team is becoming demoralized. So how might you phrase that feedback to your manager? So this would be an example of giving upward feedback. Again, you heard from a colleague that the timeline of your product launch was pushed up by your manager. The beta version is scheduled for release 2 weeks ahead of the date you had already discussed. Your manager did not tell you. This is the third time this kind of thing has happened, and your team is becoming demoralized. How might you phrase that upward feedback? Take a few minutes to reflect and type your thoughts into the group chat. How would you phrase this upward feedback? I'm emphasizing that is a tough one. Indeed, this is a tough one. What do you think? Just type a few thoughts into the group chat. DK is saying, I've heard the project has been pulled in. Can I ask why? And why wasn't myself and my team consulted? It's happened a couple of times and I want to avoid it again. AP, I've heard you push the timeline to be shorter. How can I help you in order to find things done before you have to push? Okay, thank you, AP. Okay, so I'm going to share a feedback formula that I find to be helpful in a feedback conversation, and then a tool that can be helpful to help you plan for any of these types of examples that you see here, plus any feedback conversation in general. Okay, so you might have heard of this feedback formula before, where you're really wanting to make sure that you share the behavior plus the impact of that behavior. So B plus I, B is behavior, I is impact. And then where appropriate, talk about the alternative positive behavior that you're looking for. So in the case of Xavier, the behavior is arriving late and unprepared to the meetings. The impact is that we need to revisit the previous 10 minutes or 15 minutes of the agenda, whatever that is. Alternative positive behavior would be, ideally, would like you to attend, having read the agenda, be prepared to speak, and at the hour that the meeting starts. So B for behavior, I plus impact, plus APB, alternative positive behavior. And I can see here in some of your comments, you're sharing some really nice examples here in that last scenario of the upward feedback of the impact of the behavior on the team. So some nice examples there. Okay, so there is a great tool available on the O'Reilly platform. I'd like to just share a couple of highlights here and direct you to the tool, which is Giving Effective Feedback. It's an HBR 20-Minute Manager series publication. And it's really practical and super helpful to plan for a feedback session. Again, this is a new manager bootcamp, so in my experience, newer managers, it can be really helpful to plan for those feedback conversations to really help you build a muscle. The more you do this, then the more you're able to flex in the moment. And, after having done this a number of times, probably don't need as much planning or prep. But this is a good tool that I find to be helpful. And sometimes if I'm having a feedback conversation and it's a really big one, I still go back to this tool to make sure that I'm covering all of my bases. So some points to prepare here. In this example, it's a little bit like the Taylor example. Judy was rude when a customer called the IT help desk. So that's a one-line overview of the feedback scenario, if you will. So what is an objective report of the behavior? The important word here is objective. So again, oftentimes we layer on meanings and assumptions. What you're really looking for here is objective. So the customer reported that Judy spoke in a sharp tone of voice. So what do we mean by rude? A sharp tone of voice, and said that she had no earthly idea how long the server would be down. As a result, we're thinking that is rude. And the customer said that when he asked for a rough estimate, Judy shouted at him. Judy shouted at him. Objective report of the effect on the team or the project. So this is back to behavior plus impact. What is the impact on the team or the project? Other help desk providers were distressed when they heard these comments. The customer complained, and it essentially put the reputation of the department and the company at risk. So this is an area that I find to be really helpful, thinking through potential objections to that objective report and how you might address them. So Judy might deny that she spoke rudely. If she does, point out the customers and the other help desk providers' reports, that they corroborate one another. It wasn't just one person said this. There were different people sharing a similar view, and then sharing with her your understanding of what qualifies as rudeness. And then here we have a high-level discussion plan. So giving Judy the facts, let her know that you're aware of it, listen to Judy's version of events, make clear that rude behavior will not be tolerated. So if a line has been crossed here, make sure that any line crossing it's made clear that that will be tolerated. And then involve Judy, brainstorm ways to avoid frustrating moments in the future. Also good to think through potential barriers to the feedback. So Judy might be angry, she might be anxious, might not want to discuss what happened, she might be shutting down in the moment, might get to more of a defensive justification stance here rather than try to describe events accurately. So ways you might overcome those barriers, don't be judgmental, hear her side of the story, give your undivided attention so you're really working on your effective listening skills here. And be willing to listen if she has feedback for you. So questions that you might have, just being curious about what happened from her point of view. How can she avoid losing control when frustrating moments occur in the future? And what questions might you be asked? What questions might Judy ask you? And you have some examples here of what those might be. And then making it clear what the short and long-term results are that you're hoping for. That, ideally in the next call, Judy is showing more respectful behavior. And it might be more of a medium to long-term strategy to find a way to make the conditions of her job less frustrating for her. So that's one version. There could be many different versions of what's going on there, but that's one version. And it can be a really helpful tool as you think about how might I prep for a challenging feedback conversation. One point I would really underscore, which oftentimes is missing within any feedback structure, and that is follow-up. So again, just to interject some reality here, oftentimes one conversation is not enough. You might have a feedback conversation, assume the difficulty is fixed. In my experience, it usually takes a couple of conversations. It might take multiple conversations. So establishing a feedback loop can be really helpful. And a couple of ideas on how you might do that are as follows. So setting some context beforehand. Again, this is back to more of a 30,000 feet perspective as you set up a really effective working relationship with each of your direct reports. And just ask them to one-on-one, how do you like to receive feedback? How do you like to receive feedback? And having that conversation maybe in the team environment as well. How will we share feedback with each other? You're probably familiar with this structure through Agile, other processes, after action review, so on and so forth. Oftentimes we contract as a team with how we might share feedback. But in my experience, too often we don't have the conversation one-on-one. How do you like to receive feedback? What might that structure look like? How can we build that in to our regular conversations so it doesn't feel so heightened when it gets to the capital F feedback conversation? So you're having this feedback exchange on a regular and ongoing basis. Back to the one-on-one check-ins, a nice agenda item to have can be reviewing the period that gone by. Maybe you check in weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, whatever your structure is, reviewing the period gone by. And then I love this frame of WWDD, so what worked well for you in the past week or 2 weeks or month? What might you do differently moving forward? So WW for worked well and DD for do differently. And then asking, what did you learn? What did you learn? Really helping the person with the metacognition, if you will, to take a step back from their experience, think through, learn from what just took place, what just happened. And again, same thing for teams. You're probably familiar with this process: after action review, after project review. What worked well? What might we do differently? Plus delta, making sure that we're capturing the positive and the constructive feedback, because that's where the learning is. If we're not having the feedback conversation, we really are missing out on the learning. So reorienting a feedback conversation to a let's increase the learning conversation can oftentimes be helpful. Okay, so as a manager, you have a lot of opportunity here to be, in due course, that example of somebody sharing they got the best feedback experience from you as a manager. And I also encourage managers to lead the way when it comes to feedback. So that means reaching out to your direct reports and asking them for feedback. And sometimes we do this in a well-intentioned way, and it's not helpful. So a question that I've seen leaders ask and managers ask is, do you have any feedback for me? I remember one example where a C-level executive was giving a presentation, and at the end of the presentation, she asked her actually folks who were 2 levels, below on the org chart, as it were, if they had any feedback on her presentation, and all 3 of them just said it was fine. It was almost like a deer in the headlights kind of moment, where it just felt like, wow, they probably did have a few ideas for improvement, but it just felt like such a heightened conversation. Like the power dynamic felt really heavy. So it can be a question, while you might be well-intentioned, it oftentimes doesn't solicit helpful feedback. So a better question, and if memory serves, I think I saw this already, or a version of it in the group chat, so you're already ahead of me, which is fantastic. What is the one thing you see me doing or failing to do that holds me back? Great question to ask. You're going to get actionable feedback, and ideally you're asking folks this question and giving them some time to think about it and get back to you. What's the one thing you see me doing or failing to do that holds me back? Another option for you to reach out and request feedback from others is to use feedback as a GPS. So an example here, I mentioned earlier when I was working on facilitating workshops back 10, 15 years ago. And I asked my manager at the time for some very direct feedback on that goal. So if you can share the goal that you're working on, maybe it's to be, it could be to run a really effective team meeting. It could be clarity around project scope. It could, whatever it is that you're personally, professionally working on, and asking your direct reports, what should I keep doing that's working well, keep doing, and what's not working well that I should stop doing, and what are some ideas you have for things that I might try, things that I might start doing to reach this particular goal. So I really like that frame of keep, stop, start. Keep, stop, start. Okay. So a few thoughts there, tools and resources on how to give feedback and how to receive feedback effectively. Okay. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit and start to dig into difficult conversations. So when the conversation